Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here and for joining promptly at noon. I'm going to slow roll this a little bit as people continue to join. But I want to thank all of you for being here for the final installment of the 2024 Great Decision Speaker Series. In particular, we want to thank our sponsors, the World Affairs Council of St. Louis and UMSL Global, the International Affairs Office at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. UMSL Global has been a partner and sponsor of the speaker series for many years. It's my pleasure on their behalf, to welcome you here today. The World Affairs Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization registered as a 501c3 with local chapters across the U.S. The goal of the St. Louis chapter is to connect the citizens of the St. Louis region to the world at large. It was founded in 1948, so they are currently celebrating their 75th anniversary. And as a reminder, their mission is to offer programs like this and many others that promote understanding, engagement, and relationships, as well as leadership in world affairs originating from the St. Louis region. They rely on donations from the community, from membership from the community. So please consider helping them celebrate their 75th anniversary by becoming a member today. Today, we welcome Professor Hiroko Muraki Gottlieb, an adjunct professor of law at the Elizabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. She is a lawyer with expertise on sustainability. Her diversified career encompasses role in global businesses, non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and academic institutions. She has a wealth of knowledge garnered from various capacities and brings a unique blend of expertise in climate change strategy, environmental law, both domestic and international, marine conservation, policymaking, and stakeholder engagement. She's also spearheaded initiatives to enhance the interfacing of science and policy as an affiliate of the Gurjui Lab at Harvard University. And I'm sure I mispronounced that lab, so I apologize for that. But with all of that, thank you very much, Hiroko, for being here today and for lending your expertise to us. With that, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's actually, it's pronounced Gurgis, but he has been a colleague of mine for almost 6 years now. But anyway, I would like to start by congratulating the co-organizers and for the 75th anniversary. I think that is quite a bit of a milestone, and so much has happened over the past 75 years. And I am so happy to talk about my favorite topic, which is the High Seas Treaty, an agreement that was adopted by nearly 200 countries last year, almost actually a year ago, in June of 2023. And the treaty consists of 53 pages of text. And I will talk about this a little bit later, but it is a result of over 2 decades of work among not just countries and regional organizations, but also scientists, indigenous peoples and local communities, civil society, academia, research institutions, and the private sector. And it is a story of hope, and I hope that we will be able to have a robust discussion after my presentation. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I always like to start with this picture that was taken. For those of you old enough to remember, this is the first sighting of the Earth. And before we saw this picture, we had always pictured the Earth as green. And I think still to this day, many children pick up the green crayon to color the Earth. But in fact, the Earth is blue, and most of the Earth, half of the Earth, is covered by the ocean. So how is this incredible, vast area of the Earth governed? Well, there is this thing called the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, and it was an evolutionary negotiations which started in 1930. And over the years, the countries came to the understanding that there has to be some sort of a global binding agreement that covers all matters of the ocean. And the intent of this agreement was that the set of rules should cover all matters of the ocean because the problems of ocean space are closely interrelated and need to be considered as a whole. And this concept actually is something that has been carried on because it's scientifically true. Now, when the negotiators concluded the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and adopted it in 1994, the negotiations actually was completed in 1982, but the agreement entered into force in 1994. The countries thought that this agreement would be sufficient for a long, long time. And because it was considered the Constitution, and it still is considered the Constitution for the ocean, that this agreement would suffice for decades. But in fact, that was not the case. So after the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea entered into force, there had been additional clarifications that were needed. So there have been two implementing agreements that are under this Constitution of the Ocean. One is on the deep seabed mining, and another is on the fish stocks agreement. So this is the fisheries that are in areas that are beyond any country's jurisdiction, and also fish that straddle the jurisdiction between the national waters and waters outside of national waters, because as we know, fish do not read maps. They don't really care about the political demarcations of the ocean. And the third agreement is actually the topic of today, which is the High Seas Treaty. So why do we need this third implementing agreement? Why is the Constitution for the Ocean and the two previous implementation agreements insufficient? Well, it is because of our own actions. And in particular, climate change has been impacting significantly in terms of the health of the ocean. So this is a newspaper article which was published in 2022. And the figures always shock me that the ocean has absorbed heat equivalent to 7 Hiroshima nuclear explosions every second, expert says. And that puts into context the number or the percentage of anthropogenic heat that the ocean has consumed, which is over 90%. And if you can picture this nuclear explosion, it is hot enough to actually turn objects and people into a shadow. So that is the level of heat that we're talking about. And of course, the amount of heat that we're creating through our actions have not decreased. In fact, the impact of climate change, the warming, have been having negative consequences to the world's ocean. And as you can see this figure, the world's ocean were hotter than ever recorded in 2023. The scientists who came up with the study, in fact, said that the ocean is boiling, that it's really changing the nature of what we've known as the ocean, as even 50, 60 years ago. And it is changing also not just the temperature of the ocean, but it's also changing the salinity. And these impacts have been noted in the biodiversity of the ocean as a whole. In addition, the Ocean warming has also created deoxygenation, meaning that there's been a reduced amount of oxygen that the ocean can hold. And the impact of that is that the loss of oxygen causes stress to marine life. It does decrease biodiversity for certain. It does shift in species distribution, and it ultimately impacts the economic value of what we can gain from the ocean. And the ocean has also been absorbing over a third of the carbon dioxide that have been emitted through our daily actions, and that is causing acidification. And so the ocean's pH balance is now off, and the ocean continues to become more and more acidic. In addition to that, we have pollution and unsustainable uses, pollution from oil spills, plastic pollution. There is a separate treaty that is being negotiated on combating plastic pollution, but it certainly is contributing to the distress that the ocean is facing. There's also been bottom trawling, as you can see in the picture below, that has been gouging the bottom of the ocean that is rich in biodiversity. So all of these combined, sometimes the scientists use the word cumulative impacts, are causing negative synergies that is continuing to stress the health of the ocean. So this report, it's a report that was commissioned by the United Nations General Assembly, and it was done in 2015. And scientists from around the world have said that because of these stressors, that the ocean is reaching its carrying capacity and nearly at its limit. And they concluded that the greatest threat comes from inaction by us, and that we will not be able to continue to benefit from the ocean's bounties. Now, this was in 2015. Since then, there's been multiple reports that have been telling us, not only confirming what the first World Ocean Assessment has said, but bringing in additional information. The second World Ocean Assessment has been provided information that not only confirm but enhance the information that we have that the ocean is being stressed. We have the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change that wrote a special report about the ocean and the cryosphere, and so forth. And now the United Nations is embarking on the third World Ocean Assessment, and the picture does not look great. So in addition to that, there has been recognition of this concept of the blue economy. So there is no definitive definition about what this blue economy means, but the World Bank has this definition, I think, which works well. And the definition is sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods, and jobs while preserving the health of the ocean ecosystem. And the key words, of course, are sustainable use and preservation of the ocean ecosystem. And this concept has been introduced in various forums, also in the United States. So here in the US, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, which is part of the US Department of Commerce, has a blue economy roadmap covering the years from 2021 to 2025. And there's been a new initiative called a New Blue Economy, which NOAA defines as a knowledge-based economy, looking to the sea, not just for extraction of material goods, but for data and information to address societal changes and inspire their solutions. So there's been significant amount of knowledge garnered from scientists and also economists and so forth about the importance of the ocean and why the ocean needs more attention, and that the current or the existing governance system is not working. So why the high seas? So areas beyond national jurisdiction. As you can see, the pale blue part of this map represents areas that do not belong to anyone in particular, and is beyond any country's national boundaries, but it is a global comment. It belongs to all of us. The area that we just saw, the pale blue area, is also rich in biodiversity. The areas beyond national jurisdiction plays a crucial role in maintaining the health and the balance of our planet. In addition, the policymakers realize that there is a web of organizations with different mandates, and there's patchwork of ocean governance of this huge area in the ocean, and decided that they really needed to do something. In the interim, there's been recognition from and voices from the developing countries that there has to be more capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, meaning that those countries that can help developing countries really need to do that. And that type of support should be mandatory. There's also been this notion that since the areas beyond national jurisdiction do not belong to anyone, why is it that only certain scientists with this advanced ships that can go out to far away in the ocean and collect samples and use that for research, and ultimately there's commercial application that could generate, potentially billions of dollars, but there's no sharing of benefit from it. And developing countries have been saying that's not fair. Why would you take something from the global commons and just benefit without sharing the benefits? So that's another concern that had been bubbling up. There's also been discussions about the role of the indigenous peoples and local communities, that there has to be more engagement, and that the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities have to be respected. So the ultimate goal of this high seas treaty is to ensure conservation and sustainable use of this huge area for the present and in the long term. And to do that, there are conservation tools, which I will discuss in a minute, that the countries felt that were needed. So what and how? So we now have a picture of what's been going on, what's been wrong with the ocean governance. So what is it that do countries need to do, and how would the countries do it? Well, to understand the scope of what this treaty would be about, it took over 20 years. So it started with an informal discussion back in 2004 and went all the way to last year when the treaty was adopted. Now, in terms of what this treaty does, the treaty provides a global vision about what the countries commit to do, which is conservation and sustainable use of this huge area. But in addition to that, how that is going to be done. One of the conservation tools that the treaty has come up with is this idea of area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. Without the treaty, there is currently no infrastructure to allow for countries to identify and implement tools that will provide conservation means or sustainable use means, and this treaty will allow for that. Another conservation tool is environmental impact assessments. So this is a tool that allows countries to understand before an activity happens if there's going to be substantial harm that would impact the health of the ocean. And the strategic environmental assessment is more of a broad picture assessment that could be done under this treaty. And the third substantive matter was this concept of fair and equitable benefit sharing associated with marine genetic resources. This is a very technical area, but in a nutshell, it really has to do with research and benefiting from that, and then distributing the wealth from that. And then, of course, capacity building and transfer of marine technology. And this element would allow more of an effective implementation of what this treaty is trying to do. There are, as I said, there were concerned about the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, that those concerns are addressed. There's also concepts about cooperation among countries, regions, and various organizations, fostering scientific exploration, research, and collaboration, that there will be financial resources, and that there will be support for implementing and for countries to comply with the requirements, and that there are means of settling disputes. And all of this has a very strong component of transparency, making sure that all stakeholders are involved, and also that they have opportunities to engage. There is an infrastructure that the treaty sets up. The conference, the party, is the decision-making body, and then we have the secretariat and these what we call subsidiary bodies, like the scientific and technical body, and the subject-specific committees. So when I say subject, they're like the area-based management tools. Actually, no, ABMTs are not the subject matter specific committees, but the marine genetic resources, for example, has a specific committee associated with the infrastructure of the treaty. The clearinghouse mechanism is a transparency tool. It will be some sort of an information technology platform where all information associated with the treaty will be available to anyone who is interested. Okay, so where are we now? So the way that the treaty work is that a country or a regional economic integration organization has to sign the agreement, and they have to ratify it. And also, once the agreement is ratified, they have to deposit it with the United Nations Secretary General. And once those three steps are done, then a country or an organization becomes a party to the treaty. And currently we have 89 signatories. And just the breakdown of that is that we have 88 countries that have signed, and the 89th is the European Union that has signed. Among that, we have four countries: Palau, Chile, Belize, and Seychelles. And what do we need to get to the treaty to enter into force? Well, we need 60 parties. So we have 56 to go, which sounds like enormous amount of work, which it is, but there are workshops and collaboration and support that is ongoing around the world. So what are next steps? So because the treaty is very, very complex, the countries have decided that there will be a preparatory commission. So before the treaty enters into force, there will be a meeting to work on some of the decisions that will need to be made once the treaty enters into force. And there's quite a list of items that the countries would need to come to an understanding on. So there's going to be a preparatory commission meeting sometime possibly end of the year, probably next year. But there's an organizational meeting about that in June. So with that, I am going to finish. And I also wanted to, again, thank the co-organizers and also to let you know that I and Peter Gerges have created this website that provides a lot of information about the treaty. And if you're interested, please visit the website and find out any questions you may have. So with that, I am going to give the floor back to Stephen.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and informative presentation. I will probably kick us off with a couple questions while I'm waiting for the audience to start chiming in. Audience, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and then I'll field them for Hiroko. So you touched on this maybe a little bit in the presentation, but I'm kind of curious. You know, it's 2 decades of work, 2 decades of negotiations, probably spearheaded and involving a lot of different stakeholders. You mentioned multiple countries and indigenous people, industry groups, different things like that. What were sort of the key sticking points or the most contentious areas of those preliminary negotiations that kind of made it drag on for several decades? Also, you're muted right now.
I should be good at this by now. So the first challenge was to get to the point of the countries agreeing that there has to be a treaty. And that took quite a bit of time. And so there had to be study upon studies in terms of what science is telling the countries, in terms of the law. What are the gaps? What do we need to, what do the countries need to do to address the concerns and the challenges that have been identified by scientists and NGOs and academia? Once the countries agreed that, okay, perhaps we could negotiate on a treaty, they had to come up with a framework, and they identified 4 substantive areas. I talked about the area-based management tools, environmental impact assessment, and marine genetic resources, and benefit sharing, and capacity building, and technology transfer. But there are a lot of details that have to be included in that. So there was a preparatory committee meeting that took 2 years for the countries to decide, okay, we're now at a point that we can move on to negotiations. So it wasn't that the countries were necessarily dragging their feet. It's just that this is a very, very complicated agreement. But I do have to say that even after the preparatory committee meetings that took 2 years, there were some notable countries that were still not convinced that a treaty was necessary. And they entered into the Intergovernmental Conference negotiations with the mindset that they have to almost minimize, the damages that this new treaty may bring on. And also, because the treaty making process at the United Nations is consensus based, if a country strongly objects, then there's really no way that the countries can agree to a treaty. So there was that opportunity for the countries that didn't really want this treaty to have a seat at the negotiation table. So many different sticking points. And once the negotiations entered into place, there were divisions certainly between the developing countries and developed countries as to what could be part of this treaty. And the major issues from the developing countries were, you can imagine that it had to do with capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. They wanted that to be mandatory. Developed countries did not. They wanted this benefit sharing to be mandatory. They also wanted monetary benefit sharing to be included. Developed countries did not, and so forth. So again, a lot of sticking points.
Yeah. I'm a political scientist by nature, so the politics and the swirling in the background between all of those different stakeholders obviously matters a lot, and it's something that's fascinating to me. I'll try not to drill down way too much into that for the sake of the
Sure.
audience, but um, we do have a couple questions now from the audience. One is similar to a question that I was going to bring up from Anthony Tompras. You know, what is basically the enforcement mechanism? So I do international human rights law. Most international human rights law does not have enforcement mechanisms. The WTO has a pretty good enforcement mechanism. Can you sort of situate this on the enforcement mechanism or the proposed enforcement mechanism on a scale of like non-existent to maybe pretty effective, or can you walk us through how that's going to work?
Sure. It's actually a very interesting question, and I gave a talk recently, and same question came up. And you're right, this agreement does not necessarily have an enforcement provision. There are no penalties per se. But the countries, because the way, just for the sake of the audience, that the way that international treaties work is that there's this international treaties, and countries have to come up with their own legislation. So arguably, at the national level or regional level, there could be enforcement mechanisms to make sure that the country stays in compliance. But at the international level, there isn't. That said, um, as I said during the presentation, that there is a huge recognition that transparency will drive compliance. And because the setting up of area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, for example, um, will have all the stakeholders that I have mentioned as part of the review process. And same with the environmental impact assessment. So the high level of transparency is likely to drive compliance. Also, the treaty has this committee called the Implementation and Compliance Committee. The role of that committee is not to enforce, but to provide support for compliance and implementation. So it's a different way of looking at enforcement. It's not necessarily like, the punish, 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 but it's let's make sure that the countries can comply.
Well, and I think there is a strong um, scholarly literature that sort of emphasizes if you make treaties really transparent with sort of clear benchmarks and things like that,
Sure.
you're better able, sort of the information politics that spring out of that transparency does a good job of promoting compliance, even if there's not official enforcement behind it. Um,
Sure. And especially these days when information, I mean, of course, there are challenges with social media, but information gets transferred like this.
yeah,
And there are so many means to make transparency really transparent. So I think it is a powerful tool.
yeah, I absolutely completely agree. Another question from the audience, Krista Wolf asks, how can we who live in the middle of the country, what can we do to avoid destroying the oceans? How do we go about encouraging the domestic political landscape to take environmental challenges in the ocean seriously?
That's a very good question. Well, we all rely on the ocean. The oxygen that we breathe, nearly 50% comes from the ocean. So that's a very, very basic thing. The water that we depend on comes from the ocean. The ocean acts as a mitigating factor or regulating factor in climate change. As I said, the ocean absorbs significant amount of heat, but there's only so much that the ocean can do. And there's going to be huge disruptions if we do not focus on the health of the ocean. It's going to impact, for example, seafood that you may be consuming. There's going to be storms and so forth that may, and heat waves and so forth that, will be impacting your region. So it's not that because you don't see the ocean that you're not benefiting or that you're being impacted. It's that the ocean is so integral to everyone's lives, that it is really an incentive for everyone to get involved. And climate change, mitigating the impacts of climate change is really important. Reducing the use of plastics is important. Understanding what fish are sustainable is really important. So there are many, many ways that we can just change even a little bit of our daily lives, actions that will support a healthier ocean. And also talk to your legislators about the importance of this IC treaty. Actually, there was a recent 60 Minutes episode on why the US should enter into the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. I don't know if you saw it, but it was really about not having a seat at the table. And for a country like the United States with significant amount of national water, national waters, and also diplomacy and presence in terms of conflicts and mitigation and so forth, not having a seat at the negotiating table is huge. And the piece is actually focused on deep seabed mining, but the concept is the same for any treaty, but particularly for the conventional law of the sea.
I think that's a really important point. And I'd like to maybe talk about that a little bit more or expand
Sure.
on it a little bit more. The US, I think this is fair to say, has a public opinion on international law problem where we don't necessarily see it as real or binding or constraining or effective. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on maybe how we could change that sort of perception about international law, which I think would make the high level, national level politics of treaty ratification probably a little bit simpler.
Right. So again, I think understanding that the US has a huge presence in the world. It is the most powerful country on earth, and recognizing the importance of international cooperation and having a seat at the table is really something that everyone should understand, and that it will impact the national security, for example. So when China built this artificial island in the South Pacific Sea and the US became involved, the piece in 60 Minutes talks about how countries were like, but you're not even a party to the conventional law of the sea. What are you doing here? And the US did counter argue that, well, we believe that the conventional law of the sea is customary international law, meaning that even if we're not a party, all these conflicts and so forth, we believe that that is a law that everyone needs to follow. But that kind of argument was not as strong as being a party and having that international presence to be able to negotiate effectively. So it's a national security issue. It is an economics issue. So not having a strong stance on the blue economy is going to hurt the country. And also, if we don't have a resilient ocean, then we're going to suffer more from climate change. So it's really important.
I think that's a fantastic answer. Just the legitimacy of the different things that we try to do or project. I think that's a really compelling argument that people often don't think about. It's really tough for us to look at, people who are violating international norms or laws and say, hey, you can't do that, if we're unwilling to even acknowledge that that international law is real, right?
Right.
So I really appreciate that answer. It really hits home for me. I
Thank
have
you.
another question from the audience. David Massey asks, does the treaty address ocean husbandry like fish farming or different things like that differently than sort of wild harvesting, free caught, free range fish? Yeah.
It could. So The tools that I'm thinking of are the two conservation tools. One is the area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. If a certain area of the high seas will be deemed to be restricted in use, then yes, so aquaculture would be impacted. Another is that if you're going to have a huge aquaculture farm, fish farm in areas beyond national jurisdiction or the high seas, then once the treaty enters into effect, you're going to have to figure out if you need an environmental impact assessment. So that's another way that this treaty could have impact on aquaculture.
Great, thank you. What do you think needs to happen to get some momentum behind the treaty in the international system? I know it's been, like you said, 2 decades of negotiation. There's currently sort of some pre-processes that are still happening. There are a good number of signatories already.
Yes.
But really it's once the ratification happens and then the deposit happens, that it really becomes far more binding. You know, what's going to motivate the next, I think 56 countries is the right number. What's going to motivate them to jump on board?
Well, that's really a good question. So the NGO communities that were and academic institutions, research institutions that were really active in the negotiations don't want this treaty to just be a piece of paper. And also champion countries also don't want this treaty that they worked so hard on and that they believe is going to make a difference in the resilience of the ocean. They want to make sure that there is progress forward. That said, the countries with very intricate legal systems and also countries with really tough political environment do have difficulty getting the treaty to the next level from the signature to ratification. And of course, US may be one of them, although I do believe that there is significant, there was significant support to get this treaty concluded. And also the US is a signatory to the High Seas Treaty. So what is happening right now is that those countries that have succeeded in becoming a party are speaking out and saying, this is how we did it, and this is why it's important. And if you look at the countries, we have Palau, Chile, Belize, Seychelles. These are all developing countries. And so the developed country champions, such as the European Union, which actually is going through the ratification process right now, and they're at the final stage of ratifying as a regional economic integration organization, are supporting ratification by other countries by doing workshops or providing information at the bilateral level. And also the United Nations Division of Ocean and Law of the Sea, which was the secretariat during the negotiations, has various webinars and so forth. And also they are accelerating their efforts to do workshops and events and so forth to convey not only importance, but the technical aspects of the treaty. Because what has been happening is that some of the countries really relied on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs within the government to negotiate the treaties. But the ministry that will be implementing the treaty will be probably a Ministry of Environment or Fisheries or whatever, outside of the foreign affairs. So there has to be internal awareness raising and understanding of, okay, if we were to ratify this treaty and become a party, what needs to be done? who is going to do what resources are needed, where are we going to get the funding, and so forth. So there are a lot of things to consider at the national level, and it's a lot of work. I have talked to various countries, and those countries that were successful have less steps to go to follow up to get to the ratification stage than some of the other countries. So it's just a matter of political will to get this done. And countries like Chile had its president saying, "This is my priority," and just got it through. And France also, the President Macron is making this a priority. So they're going through the accelerated ratification process, although it is a lot of steps.
That's super informative. Thank you so much. I have
Sure.
another question from the audience from Fanongo Vainga Mangisi Mafileo. How does the treaty consider regime interaction? So I'm guessing this is different international laws like the Paris Agreement, probably even the World Trade Organization agreements, different things like that that will affect or be related to hopefully more complementary than competing with the High Seas Treaty.
That's a very good question. And in fact, during the negotiations, of course, we had various regional organizations and international organizations. As you saw, the web of different governance schemes of the high seas, we have existing organizations, existing laws, and those organizations wanted to make sure that, I mean, if you look at it negatively, that this treaty would not be stepping on their toes. So this concept of not undermining came about, and it is referenced pretty much throughout the agreement. And of course, not undermining can be read in different ways. There's the negative reading of it, which is not stepping on toes. There's the positive reading of it, which is collaboration and cooperation. So the treaty does not define what not undermine means, but it does have a clause about collaboration and cooperation. So there's going to have to be a lot of that, understanding who does what. For example, International Seabed Authority has mandate over the deep seabed and the minerals. There are, in fact, organisms that thrive in the seabed area, and there may be discussions about, is the environmental impact assessment that is being done, is it sufficient, and so forth. So it really, in my mind, this whole concept of not undermining has to be driven by cooperation and collaboration. And the other aspect that I wanted to mention is that in terms of benefit sharing, there's this concept about digital sequence information. This is getting just a bit to the weeds, but anyway, that terminology is currently being negotiated in a different convention of biological diversity. And so there's going to have to be some sort of understanding as to harmonizing what happens in this separate convention and what happens in the High Seas Treaty. So absolutely, there are definitely interlinkages or room for collaboration.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. I'll take my prerogative as moderator and ask another one from my list. There is no treaty that is just so incredibly comprehensive that it's going to preclude the need for future treaties. So I think you kind of did a really thorough, fascinating job of sort of laying out like how the High Seas Treaty builds on previous work, and how that previous negotiations didn't necessarily predict some of the challenges that we're facing today. I know this just got ratified at the end, or signed at the end of last year, and 2 of the 4 countries ratified this last month. But what are some issues moving forward that you see that will maybe need to be negotiated next as a protocol or a future treaty?
Um, Another great question. So when the negotiators were discussing this at the United Nations, the the word or the terminology that was used often was future proofing. Let's make sure that this treaty will be sufficient for decades to come, which is a tall order. I mean, we tried, and that's why it was great to have the scientific community involved because they could provide objective information to the policymakers and say, this is in the horizon. And the reason why the clearinghouse mechanism, in fact, was not uh, agreed upon is because the negotiators needed more time to understand what would be the best platform. And of course, it was a good idea because since even within the last 12 months, there's been this explosion of artificial intelligence and machine learning that may significantly impact how a clearinghouse mechanism may be built. So there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the details, but rather than thinking about amending this new treaty, what is going to happen is that many of the details were that negotiators decided would be decided once the treaty enters into force and at the level of the conference of the parties, which is a decision-making body. And so, for example, the clearinghouse mechanism, how the structure, the platform will be decided by the conference of the parties. The secretariat is not most likely not going to be at the United Nations headquarters in New York. And so the conference of the parties will decide where the permanent secretariat will be seated. Chile is volunteering, and it's possible that Chile would have that seat. But things of that nature do not need a treaty amendment. And so the list of things that need to be worked on are actually in the treaty text. And there are numerous things, and some of the things actually were kicked to the conference of parties because the negotiators wanted to conclude the negotiation of the treaty. So when negotiating a treaty, you kind of have to balance: do you want to conclude the negotiations, or do you want to include a key aspect that you really wanted to, negotiate on? So it was a tough act, and after, I think it was a 3.5 days of lack of sleep, the negotiators decided this list of items will be decided later. And I should add that that is why the United Nations General Assembly has agreed to host this preparatory commission meeting, and the organization meeting of that will be happening in June. So we shall see.
I think that's a really strategic move by the negotiators, right? You don't want this to turn into like the Doha round of the World Trade Organization negotiations, which are
Right,
never going to end.
right.
So yeah, having a mechanism where you can refer it back to, the relevant parties, I think probably getting something on the books is at some point becomes very important. So uh,
Right, right.
that's really interesting. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to start to wrap us up here. I want to be
Sure.
respectful of your time. Really appreciate your time and expertise and your engagement. So before I, formally conclude with everything, do you have any final thoughts, big takeaways, last words? I'll throw it over to you for that.
Sure. Thank you so much. So I started the talk with the idea that, this agreement was a work of this vast number of people, and some people dedicated over 20 years of their lives to this process. And when this negotiation, stretched out all these decades, there's been wars, there's been, a pandemic, and there's been natural disasters and so forth, but the countries stuck it out, and they were able to come to an agreement on this incredible treaty. And I just hope that the treaty enter into force as soon as possible. And I'm working towards that. And that the more people that talk about the treaty, the better. And I hope that the knowledge that I share today will be spread out even more than than this platform. So please continue to speak and share the knowledge.
Fantastic. Thank you so much once again for your time, your expertise, and your engagement, as well as that encouraging note to get out and be active about an area that probably many people in St. Louis were either not aware of or probably not as passionate about as we could have been. So thank you again, Hiroko, so much. As a reminder to everybody, this event was co-sponsored by the World Affairs Council of St. Louis and UMSL Global. The World Affairs Council of St. Louis relies on donations and memberships to continue to sponsor great events and great series like this. So please consider becoming a member today. Thank you, audience, for your great questions and your engagement today and throughout the 2024 speaker series. I've enjoyed being your moderator, and I hope to see you all again next year. This is going to wrap up our 2024 series. Thank you all again very much for your time and your engagement as well. Have a great day.
Thank you.